welcome to Worlds Apart. Freedom of speech is one of the pillars of democracy and also the one that in the West is perceived as being in greatest peril. With the left claiming that it has become a vehicle co-opted by the right to spread hate, and the right deriding the left as sinister, snowflake censors, just what are the boundaries of free speech? Well, to discuss that, I'm now joined by British activist Tommy Robinson. Mr. Robinson, it's good to see you. Thank you very much for coming over.
It's good to be seen.
Now, what brings you to Russia?
I'm giving a presentation tomorrow to explain the history and the dangers of what's called grooming, which is more of a rape jihad.
Mm-hmm. Now, speaking about the topic of your talk, correct me if I'm wrong, it's titled The Rape of Britain. I know that you are prone to generalizations, but isn't that too broad and too threatening of a statement?
No, it's not. And prone to generalizations, I say first, in my rape and discussion, I talk about Islam. Not Muslims in general. Not every.
How can you talk about Islam and not talk about Muslims in general?
Because Islam's an idea. It's a book. It's an idea. To criticise that idea.
But it's practiced by Muslims.
But if I criticise Christianity, I'm not insulting or picking fault at every Christian. I'm picking fault at the idea. So when we see the rape levels that we've seen in our country, and from a population, Muslim males make up 2.2% of the British population. They are responsible for 84% of the convictions of this type of rape. And what you have to ask the question is why, which we're not allowed to ask.
Well, I think you pointed out very specifically that it's this type of rape, and I suggest that we talk in more detail about various kinds of rape. But before we do that, when I heard the title of your talk, The Rape of Britain, the immediate association that I got was with the book The Rape of Nanking. It's a very famous book describing 6 weeks in 1937, during which the Japanese forces killed at least 200,000 Chinese civilians and raped at least 20,000 Chinese women. Even with those even with those cases that you're trying to highlight, the statistics, the rape statistics in Britain is nowhere near that. In fact, if you look at the statistics, Britain is pretty much on par with other developed countries.
19,000 children in 2018 were groomed by these gangs in 1 year. So when you talk about the rape of Britain, if I give you the statistics, we have a town called Telford. It has a 1.8% Muslim population. 1,000 children were raped by those gangs. 5 have been murdered in that town alone. When you take the 1.8% and you take away under 16s and you take away over 65s, there's only 956 Muslim men in that town. The police have identified 200 in Operation Chalice. That means that 21% of the Muslim men in that town have been involved in the rape and torture of our daughters.
Mr. Robinson, 21%. You refer to them as Muslims, but, you know, I'm not a Muslim myself, but yes. I'm married to a Muslim.
Okay.
And I know for a fact that Islam imposes very strict limits on extramarital sex, not to mention rape. I mean, those people that are convicted of raping anyone, they would not be considered Muslims by Islam. Why do you have to tie it to
If you come and see, if my presentation I give tomorrow proves all of this, categorically proves it. It says 4 times in the Quran that outside of your 4 wives, you can take whatever the right arm possesses. Sexual slaves. And I have, on my video, I will have imams and experts confirming what that means, sexual slaves. I also look at witness testimonies from the victims. And I also listen to what the perpetrators said in court. So the men, when they were sentenced in Rotherham, all of them chanted Allah Akbar. The comments they make were about, you know, whilst we're on the grooming scandal, one of the girls they murdered, the day before he murdered her, he sent his friend a message saying he's sending that kuffar to hell.
But
kuffar being non-Muslim.
Understanding of Islam, but I'm sure you would agree that there are hundreds of thousands, millions of Muslims who would be just as revolted at the idea of a girl or, you know, a boy or a child being raped as they are. And by referring to them as Muslims, you are also tainting those individuals because they subscribe to the Muslim faith as well.
I'm not tainting them. What I'm saying is, if 84% of convictions are Muslim males from 2.2%, why do you think that is? Why the massive...
I don't know where you got the statistics from, because...
That's from the Quilliam Foundation, which is a Muslim anti-extremism think tank.
But, I mean, the last time I checked, British police actually does not keep track of or does not release the ethnicity or the religious affiliation of the perpetrators.
Out of the 404 so far, men who have been convicted for this type of rape.
Again, you keep referring to this type of rape, but I mean,
brothers, cousins, work colleagues.
In most countries, developed countries, and the UK is no exception here, the majority of rapes are perpetrated by the locals, and in the British case, it would be white males. Are you saying that a British girl being raped by her British neighbor is somehow less offensive than a British girl being raped by her ethnic Pakistani neighbor?
No, it's not. What I'm saying is that you have type 1 and type 2 in the UK. That's how it's learned. Type 1 is where gangs of men who know each other, they're usually related. In most of these cases, in every town and city, brothers, cousins, work colleagues. That has never happened in the UK. Out of those convictions, 0.5% have a British name. 0.5%. Now, when we're talking about type 2 paedophilia, that is lone paedophiles sharing their sexual fantasies with other lone paedophiles via the internet or grooming in that process. Literally exclusively, that is white. But that's because we live in an 87% white country. That hasn't been covered up. What we have seen, for example, in Manchester, a young girl was injected with heroin in 2003. She was 15 years old. She was murdered by a 50-year-old Muslim male who had been grooming her and raping her. The police launched an investigation, OK? They identified the perpetrators. Then in 2005, Colin Cramphorn shut down the investigation, OK? He closed it. He was rewarded by the British state, a CBE, the biggest award you can get for hiding this fact. Then we had the investigation in Telford, where local politicians blocked an investigation.
We've seen a cover-up. I can easily believe that politicians or local authorities could be covering that out of political correctness, but this...
In every town and city. If it was one town or two, but we have seen grooming gangs operating in 44 cities, and we've seen every one of them.
But look,
that is an
organized
establishment.
crime
That is
exists
organised.
in all countries, and in many countries, Russia, for example, prostitution rings or human trafficking rings are run by ethnically homogenous groups. Britain is no exception here. I know for a fact that there are many ethnic Russians involved in human trafficking in Western Europe, perhaps even in the UK, but they're doing that not because they're Russians. They're doing that because they're criminals. Why are you portraying it as a religious issue rather than a criminal one?
In my presentation tomorrow, you'll hear from the victims. So the victims say it's racial and religious. The perpetrators say it's racial and religious. The Quran and the Scripture supports and justifies these actions against non-Muslims.
That's just simply not true.
It is true. And unfortunately, when we're not talking about sexual gratification here. We're talking about one young girl, 12 years old, had her tongue nailed to a table. Another young girl, they heated up an iron rod with the letter M, and they scolded it on her bum at 11 years old because she was the property of Muhammad. These girls are being tortured.
I can take any book. I can take Bible and use it as a pretext for the most horrible crimes. But are you actually believing that those are the people of faith?
I'm saying they're following the teachings of Muhammad. Muhammad had sexual slaves. Muhammad legitimized and had...
Come on, I can tell you that lot from you know, it's explained in the Bible, he slept with his daughters. I mean, but we are not using that in a literal sense. I mean...
What I look at tomorrow is what the victims were told. So I give the statement, we can have sex with you once you start your period, OK? Then I question, let's have a look whether that is Islamic. For example, in Pakistan, they tried to ban underage marriage, and it was found by the ideology of Islam that it was un-Islamic. Why would marrying a child and having sex with her, a child, be un-Islamic? We have had 30 children married in the borough of London, in one borough of London.
Islam is a very large religion, and there are many strains within Islam, and some interpretations of Islam are indeed horrendous, as are some interpretations of the Bible. My problem with that is that, again, you would agree that there are many good people among Muslims, those people could be your allies. They could be the ones who would be looking after those potential predators, but you are alienating them by suggesting that their faith is directly responsible for the crimes of those individuals.
Boko Haram gave justification. Boko Haram, a terrorist organisation in Nigeria, they give justification for kidnapping girls and enslaving them, saying it's quoted by Allah. Muhammad commands it. ISIS done exactly the same. ISIS are taking slaves, Boko Haram are taking slaves, and across every town and city in my country, they're taking slaves. My worry is, if we're worrying about me offending some people with my speech, a generation of my daughters,
let me give you another example.
Of our daughters have been kidnapped and raped.
You are a self-described British patriot, right?
Yes.
And I'm sure you know that the British legacy in some countries is pretty abhorrent. I mean, take the colonial crimes in Africa, in India. For example, just as recently as the 1950s, the British forces used rape and castration to put down uprisings in Kenya. They paid compensation to the victims a few years back. Would it justify me to throw around labels like British killers or Anglican rapist at anyone who has any relation to the British identity?
I don't live in the past, and I'm not throwing those accusations at every single Muslim. So for me, it's an irrelevant point.
You're evading my question. Would that justify me calling anyone who has any relation to the British state, because it was the British Army, the British forces who were perpetrating those crimes, not just individuals, but actually the state institution that authorized this kind of treatment of people? Would that justify me throwing that kind of labels at anyone who is connected to the British state?
No, it wouldn't, but I'm not throwing those accusations at anyone that's connected to Islam.
But you're referring to them as Muslim rapists.
No, they were Muslim rapists.
But I mean, how is it different from the British rapists then?
Because these men are Muslims and they're rapists and they're raping young children.
And those men were also British and they were rapists and they castrated individuals?
I have no problem with you labelling those people who commit those crimes as British rapists. You don't have to tell me the injustices.
No, but I mean, we are talking about generalizations here. Because
I'm not generalised. I'm talking about Islam. People have to get the understanding that Islam is an idea and Muhammad is its founder, and we have a right to criticise and look at his life. Because when you look at his life and you see that he pillaged, he murdered, he raped, his wife, Sophia...
There's a lot of violence in most holy books.
But if you understand, say the Beslan school attack was what woke me up. That was my moment that changed.
I don't consider those people Muslims at all. I mean,
okay, you don't. But with the Beslan school attack, there was a Jewish tribe and they surrendered to Muhammad, yeah? And this is in their scripture, Sahih Bukhari. This is in Ibn Ishaq's bio. But you have to understand the relevance of it. This is why it's so relevant, which I'll show tomorrow. Because when the Taliban took children in Pakistan, in Peshawar, when they what Muhammad done when the Jews surrendered, he pulled their pants down. Whoever had pubic hairs was beheaded.
But
that's
Mr.
exactly
Robinson, as somebody who's reported from a lot of front lines, especially from the Muslim countries, I know that
that's what the Taliban done. The Taliban give a statement saying they've done it because Muhammad done it.
Many of those people were killing
Muslims.
Yes, exactly. And these are the good people that I identify with. For some reason, you are only identifying Muslims with the bad people.
I'm not. What I'm identifying is that these attacks, 1400 years later, they used the scripture to justify the attack. Now, what I'm saying is, when we see, and no one can explain it, and we're not even allowed to ask the question, what I want to do is prevent another generation of our daughters being raped. And if we have to ask serious questions to investigate why these Muslim males feel that they can do that, why brothers, one group of them, to celebrate Eid, they kidnapped a 15-year-old girl and gang raped her, and they said in court it was to celebrate Eid. Could you imagine any Christians celebrating Easter by kidnapping a Muslim child and gang raping her for 36 hours?
I think Christians have a very long history of horrendous crimes.
But not justifying it with their religion, not making comments of their religion, not making derogatory comments. Are
you killing me? Are you kidding me? I mean, we don't have time to go into that, but there are plenty of historic examples of that. I want to ask you about this specific case, the grooming case that you got yourself entangled with.
Yes.
And that was indeed an example of an ethnic gang specializing in sexual predation. That court delivered or resulted in very, very harsh sentences. I think the defendants were collectively sentenced to over 220 years in prison.
Not all of them. One of them's in Pakistan because they let him the day they put me in jail. They let the rapist go home.
But by and large, the court recognized that it was indeed a campaign of rape against teenage girls. Do you think justice was served in that case?
Justice will be served if many of them who hold dual nationality are deported when they get out of prison. I formed the English Defence League to highlight these sorts of issues. It was a total cover-up. The British establishment, the British press were involved. The journalist who was given an award for exposing this in 2011 has admitted that he knew about it 7 years prior. Everyone in our British establishment and British elite has facilitated and allowed our daughters to be raped through the fear of political correctness.
Mr. Robinson, we have to take a very short break now.
Okay.
We will be back in just a few moments. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Worlds Apart with British activist Tommy Robinson. Mr. Robinson, just before the break, you were talking about this culture of silencing. And I think in many countries, the authorities do underreport those cases, specifically out of fear of encouraging ethnic hatred and or religious hatred. That happens in Russia as well. And I know for a fact that you haven't been convicted of a hate crime, but a lot of your followers have crossed that line and took out their anger or frustration on people who did nothing wrong. Does it bother you?
A lot of my followers.
Some of your followers.
Some of my followers. And would you say that somehow that would be my fault?
No, I don't think it's your fault, but perhaps I would say that it should have encouraged you to be more specific in your
what about if I wrote a manifesto, and in that manifesto I told them they can attack people? Then would it be my fault?
Yeah, but you can also tell them that, you know, there are people who are committing crimes and there are people who have nothing to do with that, and you should not take your anger out on those people.
I'm not. What I'm saying is I have only ever called for peace. I've never called for violence. But we do have a book that calls for violence and promotes murder. And people were so quick to stem me with what some of my so-called followers may have done. But then when it comes to Islam, and you have a Muslim like who beheaded Lee Rigby, and he hands over 55 verses in the Quran that he says forced him to do it, we're still not allowed to talk about Islam. We're not allowed. And as you said, I'm banned from every single social media, OK? That's not one. I'm banned from YouTube. I haven't got PayPal. I'm banned from all of them. We have laws in my country against inciting hatred. I've never been arrested for hate speech. I've never even been questioned about any hate speech or crimes. The truth, I was removed from Twitter for stating the fact that I've told you today. Muslim men make up 2%, they represent 84% of convictions. It's a fact. Anyone can look at it. That's not hate speech. So what we see now is the British establishment have hid these crimes. You said they were underreported. They've not been underreported. They've been hidden. And they hid them. And then they realised, because there was such furor on the streets for 2 years with the English Defence League, they realised they've got to now deal with it. So then they started making arrests. And in fact, if you look at the graph of when these arrests started, in the first 11 years before the English Defence League formed, there were 11 arrests. The next year after the English Defence League formed, in that 1 year, there was 36 arrests, 40 arrests, 72 arrests. They've had to do something. But the full cover-up mode that they're still in is now, out of the last 49 trials, only 6 have been openly reported on.
Your main problem is not with a random person on the street, even if he or she happens to be a Muslim.
No, totally. I grew up in Luton Town. Some of the best people I've met in my life are Muslim.
OK, so your main beef is with the British authorities who are turning a blind eye to this issue. Don't you think that by focusing on one particular group, in this case Muslims, you're making it all too easy for the British authorities to dismiss or deflect from a very legitimate issue that you are raising, that is how the immigration policies are being structured, and the fact that many people feel that they have no say in how those policies are being formulated. Aren't you playing into their own hands?
No, I will tell the truth. Bluntly tell the truth and continue to do so.
But are you more interested in bluntly telling something or actually having an impact?
I've seen the Overton window shift. I've seen it. 10 years ago, people called me an extremist. They said I was lying. Even what I proved tomorrow in my speech, in 2010, I told the Times newspaper that Muslims were taking children into paedophilic prostitution rings with heroin. They called them extraordinary claims. Now all those journalists are catching up and they're reporting on it. Just as these
Are they reporting it just as you formulated? Muslims are taking children into paedophilic ring?
Yes, they're starting to. It's now common knowledge in my country, which it wasn't 10 years ago. People said we were lying, OK? It's now proven.
I mean, how would you even know that they're Muslims? I mean, for God's sake.
I'll go through the comments from their court cases. The Somali gang, they said it was part of their culture to do this, OK?
But, I mean, culture is not the same as faith.
Another Muslim said he was teaching the women a lesson for being out and being uncovered. You can take a verse in the Quran. There's a verse in the Quran that clearly states a woman must cover as to separate herself, as to not be molested.
But there are many other verses that would tell you that humans and women have to be treated in a good way, and I'm the best example of that now.
Can you give me one of those verses?
Absolutely. I mean, my whole life is a proof of that. But
no, your whole life is a proof of a decent Muslim man that you're with.
Which is not an exception, which are the majority of the Muslim population.
But what I'm saying is that's not proof that Islam promotes that. That's not proof that the Quran promotes values.
I think you're extremely cherry-picking, as you sometimes do with the facts. Let's talk about immigration, because I think there is actually a substantive issue here, and I think that on that front, the movement that you are representing is actually contributing to change. just the other day, there was a Munich Security Conference, a large conference for NATO countries, and they produced a report called Westlessness, in which they identified nationalist aspirations as the sort of the biggest challenge to the so-called Western project. And they actually suggested that many of those nationalist aspirations are driven by the immigration policies and the failure of the authorities to communicate and to engage the public effectively on those issues. Don't you think that you have actually contributed to that shift in perspective? Because I would agree with you. A few years ago, nobody would discuss immigration in detail. You would be accused of being a racist.
You still are. You still are accused of being... Well, essentially, if you went to the right school in the UK or you're from the right class, you're allowed to talk about it. If you're from a working class background and you have an accent like I do, you're automatically deemed a racist or extremist. And the reality is that the towns and cities that immigration affects is towns like where we live. It's areas. When I was born in 1982, we had one mosque. We now have 35. I've witnessed my whole entire town change, and not for the better. There is less freedom. There is more trouble. We feel alienated in our own communities, and the whole time we're told that diversity is great whilst our daughters are being kidnapped and raped, whilst we have, in Britain, we have 22,000 Muslims on a terrorist watch list. 22,000. 3,000 of them are monitored 24 hours a day, 7 days a week at a cost of £9 billion a year. So the questions we're asking is, if we've already got all these problems, I think 6 refugees so far have committed terrorist attacks in Europe. Why are we still not dealing with...
If you had a choice,
yes,
how would you deal with that issue? Because you certainly, I mean, many of your Muslim neighbours are British citizens like yourself.
Yes. Yep.
What would you change to make your society a bit more mutually
integrated?
Respectful?
I've said that in my hometown, we have every form of immigration. My mother was an Irish immigrant to the UK. We have St. Lucia.
There was also a long history of Irish violence, right? You know that?
Terrorism?
Yeah.
Yes, but as you said, Irish violence. If it was Catholic violence, the Polish might have got involved or the Italians might have got involved.
I mean,
it was a war
my point is that violence is not exclusive to any particular group, right?
When my mum come to Luton, they had no blacks, no dogs, no Irish was on the doors. So I know about discrimination against people based on what other groups do. But what I'm saying is, St. Lucian, Jamaican, Bulgarian, Italian, all of my friends, we have integration. It actually works with the different communities. The one section that does not is the followers of Islam. And I'd say that's pretty much because we have 35 mosques, many of them funded by Pakistan, and many of them funded by Saudi Arabia. We shouldn't take any Saudi money, Qatari money, Iranian money.
That's a political problem. You understand that? That's not a religious problem. You're absolutely right. This country, for example, we also have, as I said to you before the recording, we have a large Muslim population, but the state does not allow the Saudi money to fund our mosques. Neither are Qatari monies allowed here. And that's done specifically to protect the local version of Islam from foreign influences. That's a political problem. What do ordinary Muslims have to do with that?
Well, no, it's a religion. Well, yeah, and 90% of the imams can't speak English. But when you're on about, say, in one borough of London, we have 32 boroughs of London. In one borough of London, and these children, not 9 years old, were married in Sharia courts in the mosques, OK? So that's to do with the imam. They're marrying children, which is against British law. They're marrying children. Some of these... and I'll read this tomorrow, and this isn't from my view. This is from a women's rights, Kurdish women's rights organisation.
You have to throw that not at a random Muslim on the street. You have to lay it at the feet of the British government for allowing that to happen.
And the promotion of child marriage under Islam and the promotion of paedophilia under Islam. It's easy, and the British government. I do lay it at the British government for allowing it to happen. I lay it at the British government. The most recent terrorist who just come out, who committed an attack recently, they knew he was going to do it. They were following him at the time, and he still got to stab 2 people. Our prisons in the UK are like ISIS training camps. I've been in them, OK? They have taken over our prison system, and they're radicalising. Totally radicalising. 800 a year come out, according to our security services.
Mr. Robinson, you understand that if you continue fuming about Islam, nothing is going to change. I mean,
it's already changing.
What is already changing?
If you look at the biggest populist parties across Europe, they're all fuming about Islam. If you look at...
fuming is one thing, but actual change is another. Speaking of which, I know that a few days ago, the British government has come up with a new immigration plan based on various points, which essentially would close the door to unskilled migrants who do not speak English up to a certain level. Do you think that plan goes far enough to address some of the problems that you are concerned about?
Personally, no. I think it's a great plan, because anyone who's coming to our country should benefit our country, not come to our country and drain it. And the only people who should be allowed in should also be able to integrate and assimilate. And what we've seen, so Angela Merkel said that multiculturalism has failed. David Cameron said multiculturalism failed.
But you just said that it succeeded in your own community, with the exception of Muslims.
I'm about to say that, yeah? That is a weak and cowardly way of saying Islam has failed. Because the reality is, the Sikh community, the Hindu community, the Jewish community, the Polish, the Bulgarians, how hard is it for a Russian person to come to the UK? It's very easy for Pakistanis, Somalis, Afghanis, Iraqis. We'd much rather have immigration, which I think that when the Polish immigration come, in my hometown of Luton, I remember thinking how great it was, because all of a sudden we had people who were culturally the same as us, hard-working, family values. The family value system in our country has been purposely targeted and broken down. The attack on Christianity, which we see, I even see our Christian leaders, we talk about the Church of England. I question if many of them even believe in Jesus Christ, or whether they're using it for their own globalist agenda.
You know, Muslims are still pretty strong on family values. I mean,
I know they are. In fact, I went just last week to meet with some Muslims. There's Muslims are protesting outside a school in the UK because they're now teaching from the age of 6 that boys can be girls and girls can be boys, and they're getting transgender.
So they could be allies, exactly.
Well,
I mean, Russia is one example where we have a pretty good relationship between the various faiths. I mean, is that not an argument for you to actually reframe your campaign not being anti-Islam, but more being anti-immigration or anti-stupid immigration?
Islam is a threat. Islam is incompatible with Western democracy and freedom. If someone takes Islam at its literal word,
if somebody takes the Bible as a literal word, it will get into the same type of trouble.
If someone wants to live as Jesus lived, are they going to kill anyone? Because Muhammad murdered, Muhammad raped. So if someone believes Muhammad is the moral compass for them, and they believe he is perfect, well, he married Aisha when she was 6, and he raped her when she was 9. So that's a problem. Okay, and to say and to speak openly and freely about it shouldn't be a crime, or we shouldn't be attacked for it. People want to kill you.
Mr. Robinson, I'm non-theist, by the way, but most religious people do not take their scriptures literally these days.
Most, but then 20% are Islamist ideology.
As I told you, also Christian fundamentalists.
22% are on a terrorist watch list. That's a small army.
I promised you a non-edited broadcast, and this is what I'm going to give you. So that's why we have to leave it there. Thank you very much for coming over.
No, thank you.
Well, and thank you for watching. Hope to see you again next Sunday on Worlds Apart.